Hey everyone, happy weekend to you. Josh of Severe Weather. Hope your weekend has gone well. It is Sunday the 19th, and I'm going to be talking about what's coming up here in the tropics over the next couple of weeks. And we're also going to be discussing severe weather and an increased risk for some major storm damage here in the plains over the next couple of days, advancing eastward. Also, some severe weather across Florida potentially. So we're going to get right to it here, and thank you for joining me. If you have not liked or subscribed to this channel, I encourage you to. I'm a meteorologist. I'm going to get pretty technical, but I'm going to try to keep it as simple as one can for this kind of a weather pattern. Here's a look at what's potentially in the works here in the next couple of weeks. Tropical development potential for the Caribbean, the Southwest Atlantic, and the Eastern Pacific. And I've got some areas highlighted where we could see a depression or storm form over the next couple of weeks. As always, when we're early in the season, we've got cold fronts that drop south into warmer water. Wind shear is there, but ingredients may come into play for something on the weaker side to develop. And sometimes a weak system can be a very impactful system if it sits and rains over you for several days. So not anything we want to overlook, but not anything super aggressive yet at this point. What's a little bit more concerning is going to be the risk for severe wind, hail, and larger tornadoes stretching from the central plains here today, especially this evening, and then advancing into the Great Lakes region here by the middle of next week. First, we're going to talk tropics. I'll get back to the severe weather for the second half of the video. Here are the names on the list. Alberto's been used every 6 years as long as I can recall, and Beryl and Chris as well. Debbie, Ernesto, Francine, Gordon, Helene, Isaac, and Joyce. I do think we're going to get down to Isaac and Joyce sometime later in August, early September, and those are the storms we have to be most concerned with. But any storm could be potentially impactful due to the fact that over time here, the warmer waters and the slower motion of storms have led to higher amounts of rainfall from tropical systems. The next part of the list is Kirk on down through Valerie. If your name is on this list, I do think you're going to be using that name. And then the last part of the list is, of course, more uncertain. But William all the way down to the supplemental names, which start with Adria. I stopped at Isla, but it's possible we could even go past 30, as a couple of forecasts have shown. That is crazy, but certainly possible. We've seen it in 2020 and 2005 as well. Here's a look at the world satellite. This is Zoom Earth, pretty neat website. It's got some ads on it, but feel free to give them a shout. And you can see nothing going on in the Pacific or the Atlantic of concern. Everything right now is in the Indian Ocean for the most part. We do have a tropical storm here off of the coast of Kenya and Somalia, or Tanzania as well. Not really a threat. Winds are about 50 miles per hour, and it is going to look like it'll threaten the coast of Somalia, but should probably fade over wind shear and cooler waters. Here's a closer, whoops, I had it up a minute ago. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Here's a closer look at that system, and this is Tropical Storm Iyali, and you can see over the last few frames a lot of the warming of cloud tops indicating that the storm is going to be weakening. So not a big threat at this point. Looking at the Atlantic, we've got several features on the map, but the area that is probably primed for development in a few days is certainly not looking that way right now. That's the Caribbean Sea. You can see this massive area of dry air in place here. These darker colors indicate subsidence, that's sinking air, that's stable air. The other place that has subsidence is the Western Gulf. So the two areas where storms typically form this time of the year are quiet for now. I don't think they're going to stay that way, but that's where we're at for now. And you can see the wave train getting going early here. Nothing developing at this point. We have strong shear out of the southwest, but we are loading up the moisture pretty early in the season, of course, and that is going to be some concern down the road. Here is a look at the Eastern Pacific. Interestingly, the GFS model, our best friend sometimes, our worst enemy at others, it showed a rapidly developing storm here off of the Mexican coast that wasn't going to threaten land. Nothing has happened. So the GFS got that one wrong. It's probably going to predict 100 storms that may or may not happen. So I'm obviously going to just do my best to sort through the mess of these potential storms and show you guys where I think things are more than likely going to happen. And the interesting case here is that wind shear and dry air both won out. We've seen very extreme heat early in the season across southern Mexico again. And wildfires have actually made the air more stable, and the model didn't quite pick up on that until it was a little bit too late. So We do have thunderstorms over the Bay of Campeche, but you can see they're just cycling over land. Nothing that's going to form into anything tropical. So for the time being, in pretty good shape here in the Eastern Pacific. In the Gulf, you can see our trough shifting over the northeastern Gulf states. We're going to have active weather in Florida today as yet another complex moves across. We have interactions of sea breeze boundaries and land. We have daytime heating. So it looks like the eastern half of the peninsula will be active later in the afternoon into this evening. Quiet weather across Louisiana should feel pretty nice. We get a bit of a break in South Texas as well before it gets active again in a few days. The Caribbean, very dry for the time being, as we've got this trough that is in place, providing some southwesterly flow over the southeast Caribbean, some flare-ups over Venezuela, over Suriname and Guyana, as well as Trinidad, Tobago. But this is certainly not anything of great concern when it comes to tropical development. And finally, the eastern Atlantic is busy as far as storm development, but again, we've got a lot of wind shear in place, hence the mid and high clouds that are streaking northeastward here, and those are going to kill off anything that will try to develop and become vertically stacked. So we'll have a lot of rain across the ITCZ intertropical convergence zone, but nothing that should form into an organized feature, at least for the next couple of weeks. I've shown this many times, but just a frame of reference, we are running hot, very hot in some places with respect to where we should be this time of the year. So we definitely have the fuel in place for tropical systems. We haven't had the structure in place for them yet, and we usually don't in May, but certainly we've got part of our ingredients in place now for what could be a very active season. I don't see this getting on the cool side of average anytime soon. The oceanic heat content is running 2 months ahead of schedule. This is what you would expect to see in late July. So once something can get going here in the Caribbean, it's going to have plenty of storm fuel, and you can see the Gulf is heading in that direction as well. So a very favorable setup for multiple storms. And really the greatest concern I have for this season isn't necessarily the number of storms, but if we do have a storm under the right environment, how quickly it can intensify. We've seen a lot of rapid intensification over recent years. This year, we already add in more heat content than average, and that is a great concern. So that's something I'll be tracking for you guys this Atlantic hurricane season. We may not have a lot of time to act on things that get into the Gulf and Western Caribbean and off the Florida and Carolina coast. So that's what I'll be watching for you guys here. Worldwide, over the next 2 weeks, you can see the Atlantic pretty quiet on development from the European. We'll have to keep an eye on the Southern Caribbean, but most of the action is going to be Bay of Bengal, east of the Philippines, south and east of Okinawa, and maybe over the Indian Ocean. Again, this is not typically a very active time of year in the tropics because the Southern Hemisphere season's starting to wind down. The Northern Hemisphere season's just starting to get going. So right now, I'm not expecting anything over the next 7 days, according to the Hurricane Center, but I do have an area I do want to keep an eye on for you guys, and I'll show you why here. Here's a look at the upper level divergence. Browns indicate stable air, convergence aloft, and as a result, we get sinking air. We don't get storm development. You can see here, as we get into next week, there will be some lightening of the color here around Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. What's going to happen is we're going to have a piece of a trough that drops down and kind of sticks down there, and waters are pretty warm. So we may see over time more development of thunderstorms that could concentrate into something tropical. So even though the Hurricane Center doesn't think there's a threat over the next 7 days, I am going to show you here in a little bit that I think there's something we need to be keeping an eye on here the next few days for gradual development. And as we head towards the beginning of June, the first week of June, things are definitely more favorable for development, both over the Eastern Pacific, the Caribbean, and the Southwestern Atlantic. And over time, you see they get more potentially favorable as well over the main development region of the Atlantic by the second week of June. This kind of profile indicates to me that we may see a very early Cape Verde type system come across and develop. So if you're in the Caribbean, again, while things don't typically get going in June, this may be an exceptional year where that can happen. As we go farther out into time, you see things remain potentially very favorable. Again, the model skill by the time we get to the end of June isn't super great. That's 6-7 weeks away, but you can see we don't have browns anytime soon, so the tropics may get going quickly here in the month of June. May. Here's a look at the upper May being they could, not the month of May. All right, anyway, here's a look at the upper level pattern to show you guys we've got this trough here over the Western Atlantic that's going to drop down and bring us some lower heights. And what will happen is ridge of high pressure expected to build into the northeast here next week. I've heard this called by many forecasters as the ridge over troubled waters. When you have a ridge building in here and a piece of energy down below into warmer water, you can sometimes have some kind of in close development here. And you can see this trough kind of lingers down in here. So this would obviously mean the Eastern Caribbean gets wind shear out of the southwest. This also means the Gulf of Mexico is going to be quiet due to that building high pressure ridge. But underneath the ridge is where we need to keep an eye on things over the southwestern Atlantic. When you have a trough kind of like this, all it takes is just some bit of a relaxation of that wind shear, and we've got potential for something to form in this area. And more than likely with this trough here and this ridge building here, it's going to have to go northeast. It's not going to go west into this ridge. So if you're in Bermuda, Hispaniola, Eastern Cuba, Puerto Rico, you definitely need to be keeping an eye on this trough that's going to be in place here next week for potentially some mischief here. So that's what I'll be watching for you guys. If we look at ensembles, we can look at these all day, but they're going to end up being wrong. I'll show them to you just to give you an idea, but you can see there are some solutions that show some tropical development. Nothing strong, but something to keep an eye on here close to Bermuda, which is right here, so south of Bermuda, towards the second part of the week. You see several solutions trying to get things to pop up and head in that direction. Interestingly, a couple of ensembles starting to pop things off very early in the month of June here over the Northwest Caribbean. So they're showing stuff. They're not necessarily right, but they are at least showing an idea that things are going to start to get bubbling up here in places where it's very quiet right now. Here's a look at the latest operational GFS just to show you guys. See, you got this front that's kind of just camped out here. We may gradually see some development here by the end of this upcoming week, north of Hispaniola, south of Bermuda. If you are planning to travel to Bermuda, maybe this upcoming weekend for Memorial Day, this is definitely something worth watching. It could get wet. I'm not necessarily worried about the wind as much as the rain, but maybe our first subtropical or tropical system, potentially. Once we get past that, things are quiet, but we may see more development later in the month of May and beginning of June. If we go back a model, you'll see this run of the GFS not showing it. The run before is showing something here, and again, kind of fantasy land here, seeing something this strong forming so quickly, but the waters are very warm down here. So, you know, this idea is something we're going to have to keep an eye on here in the month of June. Precipitation could be very heavy here across the central Caribbean. Look at eastern Jamaica, look at Haiti, look at the Turks and Caicos. By the time we get to the end of the week, there's a potential to see over a foot of rain across some of this area. Even in Bermuda, potentially 2, 3, 4 inches of rain by next Monday. So a very deep amount of tropical moisture coming up out of this trough here. And I am concerned about our friends in Haiti here for potentially some significant flooding. I'm a little concerned in Dominican Republic as well, Jamaica, Southeast Cuba, and Puerto Rico. But Haiti is, of course, the country that I get most concerned about when we see a setup like this. And it only gets wetter over the following week here over the western and southwestern Caribbean. Just a very wet pattern coming. You'll see things are going to start getting wet as well here across the islands here by the time we get into the beginning of the month of June. Interestingly, the Western Gulf is going to be pretty dry as this ridge of high pressure builds in. It should be very hot along the Gulf Coast, Florida heating up as well by the time we get to Memorial Day. When we see systems drop down, they don't have to be big ones to cause problems. If they sit for a few days, we have issues. This I'm not predicting is going to happen yet, but this was 2001. Tropical Storm Allison caused 40 inches of rain in the Beaumont, Houston area, just tremendous amounts of flooding. Then that came up through the Carolinas and up the East Coast. This was just a little bit of a piece of energy. It didn't really get a chance to crank up in anything big, but it sat and it sat and it sat and rained. And we are definitely in a pattern where something like that can happen, not necessarily in the Western Gulf states, but down across Florida and across the East Coast and down across the Bahamas and Central Caribbean here by the time we get into early June. Let's shift our focus to severe weather. I'm going to try to make this pretty quick, but you can see things are pretty active. Trough of low pressure here, keeping things gray across the Carolinas. This is going to lead to some active weather across Florida later today. Our next trough is becoming negatively tilted. You can kind of see it's kind of like this here. And as that advances this afternoon into Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, we are likely going to see a major episode of severe weather. And it's going to follow with more pieces of energy that are going to cause some issues for us down the road here this upcoming week. Could be a pretty active tornado week, but certainly a derecho is something we may be looking at here over the next few days. You can see why. We've got an active Pacific jet system after system coming northeastward here. The first one moves up into the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. Wisconsin saw a preview of that last night. We may see it again by Tuesday. Another piece on Wednesday. This could be a very active day. And the pattern continues to cycle itself right on through this upcoming weekend. Then things are going to quiet down a little bit, but still pretty active here across the plains for at least the next 5 or 6 days, and then across the south as we get later in the next week. And you can see that here. This area of red shows a pretty decent chance of seeing severe weather across the center of the country here, as well as up into Michigan as well. Next week, that gets suppressed a little bit here, but the southern plains will remain active. And then as we get into the first full week of June, we again will probably see high pressure over the Gulf, active storm track to the north of it from Kansas to the Carolinas and the Mid-Atlantic region. Last week, we had probably what I would call 2 derechos. The first one, a questionable one, but Louisiana all the way into Florida, we saw significant wind damage and tornadoes. The one that's gotten more press, though, was the one that hit Houston here back on Thursday. In an enhanced risk area, we saw widespread wind gusts up to 60 to 70 miles per hour. And a lot of tall buildings probably had higher wind gusts than that. And that continued on into Louisiana. This technically was a derecho, even though some of these storm damage reports ended up being over the Gulf of Mexico where nobody lives. But today we are likely in a big outbreak of severe weather and probably another derecho with hurricane force winds, a couple of tornadoes, and very large hail. In fact, the Hurricane Center has a moderate risk for straight line wind damage with 100 mile per hour potential wind. Big time wind that we're talking about here just north and west of Wichita. Salina, Hutchinson, all the way over to near Garden City, Kansas is highlighted in this moderate risk. And there's a chance that this could shift a little bit as well. There's a slight risk all the way up into the Dakotas, all the way north and east towards St. Joe's, maybe Kansas City and close to Des Moines overnight, all the way down just to the north of Oklahoma City. Places like Edmond and Stillwater do have that risk for severe weather. Not a major tornado outbreak expected. It's the wind and the hail that people are most concerned about that are watching this. And you can see a hatched area where we potentially could have hurricane force wind and at least a 45% chance of that occurring. So a northeastward moving derecho expected to get going late this afternoon and continue into this evening with very big hail expected at the first part of this as well. We could see baseball-sized hail somewhere in this hatched area. Tomorrow we will see still some severe weather, but the risk for the most intense storms does drop off some, at least for now. Now, we could see this area expanded somewhere up into the Lake Michigan area. We could see an enhanced risk in here, but the forecast certainty is not great for that to happen just yet. As we roll into Tuesday, that next piece that I talked about before is going to be an issue. We now have an enhanced risk encompassing a more populated area: eastern Kansas, eastern Nebraska, most of Iowa, southeast Minnesota, southwest Wisconsin, western Illinois, and the northern half of Missouri. There's a chance that this is the day we start to see more tornadic action over Kansas, over Missouri, over Iowa, and maybe western Illinois. Des Moines will certainly be at that risk of potential tornadoes. And then that threat shifts eastward and sort of flattens out from basically lower Ontario all the way down into southeastern Oklahoma. That risk for severe weather continues on the southern tail for Thursday as well. Here's a look at the predictive radar, and you'll see this afternoon. Here's where the storms blow up. I'm going to zoom in on you guys here just to show you in a minute. You can see that lifts away and weakens. Here's the next piece, Monday night, Tuesday morning. This model stops there, but here's a look at Kansas. And as we get into this afternoon, around late afternoon, 3, 4 o'clock, western Kansas storms are going to blow up pretty quickly. And they're going to advance quickly northeastward right through the middle of Kansas right after dinner tonight, and then all the way over towards Kansas City by about 10 or 11 o'clock. The radar doesn't look super bad here, but some of these storms could produce some major wind damage as they move eastward across Kansas this evening. Here's a look at what the HRRR model is showing as far as wind speeds goes. And this is right around lunchtime today, not much going on, but this afternoon, we see it starting all the way in southeast Colorado and advancing to about 4 o'clock into western Kansas. And then look at this swath of damaging winds. Gusts may exceed 95 miles per hour and possibly over 100 miles per hour. This is just one run of the model as things move east-northeastward across Kansas here. The worst of that wind likely going to be over the middle of Kansas here around 6 or 7 o'clock tonight. and then advancing eastward here. This is around 10 to 11 o'clock. The model stops at that point, but it's possible this continues on into Kansas City and St. Joe's and maybe southeastern Nebraska here as we get closer to midnight tonight. Here's a zoomed out version of this model run. Oklahoma still has a threat for severe weather as well, especially the northern tier of Oklahoma this evening. That includes Bartlesville, maybe Tulsa as well. But most of this is going to be Kansas and on northward. We're going to get a bit of a break. More storms flaring up tomorrow evening in eastern Colorado, probably just east of Denver, but keep an eye on things there. Western Nebraska, western Kansas at night. And then we're going to see things getting more active here in the warm sector later on Tuesday. The model stops at 1 o'clock central, but there is likely going to be some severe weather across this area. Looking farther south, and I forgot to reload Sundays. We were looking at a couple days ago at this area. But you can see Oklahoma is going to have active weather tonight. I do think there'll be a few tornadoes across this region, but this is going to lift out of here, and we should have a lot quieter weather for tomorrow and Tuesday. High pressure builds in. It gets pretty toasty here, and then as this system sags southward later in the week is when we have our potential problems. Here's a look at the Midwest real quick for you guys. And again, reload would be nice. We're going to see scattered showers and storms firing up over Appalachia here later today. Some of these could produce some hail, locally strong winds and very heavy rainfall, but shouldn't be as active as yesterday was. We get a break tomorrow, and then the system is going to roll into the region on Tuesday. And again, the model stops here at 1 or 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. So most of our weather should be coming later in the day and at night. And finally, the East Coast. It's going to be pretty gray today in the Carolinas, but improving across the mid-Atlantic region up into the Northeast. Shouldn't be a bad day at all today, and tomorrow looks pretty nice as well. We'll start to see brighter conditions and warmer temperatures as we head into next week. Finally, in the Southeast, active weather expected today. You can see our front drops down into Florida. The upper level trough lags behind it. We're going to see some heavier storms over eastern Georgia, the low country of South Carolina, as well as up here around Talladega, Rome, Georgia, maybe Chattanooga here, and then dying off after dark tonight. Tomorrow we should see some pretty good weather across this area, kind of a backdoor front. You can kind of see how things advance southwestward, but things should quiet down across Florida after an active day today. We've got a slight risk for the Space Coast, the Treasure Coast, all the way down to Broward County and Palm Beach counties. There is a threat for a few tornadoes here, a bigger threat to see strong winds and hail across this entire region. Here's a closer view of what we're expecting. And you can see our front sags down into the I-4 corridor around 10 or 11 this morning. And then as we have heating of the day, things are going to quickly pop up here the first part of the afternoon around the Space Coast, moving through the Treasure Coast around mid-afternoon, and then exiting by the time we get to about 6, 7 o'clock here. Maybe another wave coming through northern Florida. I don't think this will be severe, but keep an eye on things for a few more hours. We should see quieter weather, though, by the time we get to tomorrow. Here's a longer term look at the GFS model. Shows our system moving away. This is the one that's going to create that trough in the Southwest Atlantic. Here's our next big system, Tuesday afternoon and evening, moving through Minnesota and Wisconsin. This entire area in here in the warm sector is at risk for severe weather. There'll be snow in Wyoming and Colorado. That's not unusual, believe it or not. There'll also be an area of showers and storms over northern New England along our boundary. But this is when things are going to be pretty rough here. Tuesday evening, anywhere from the Chicagoland and Milwaukee areas right on down towards St. Louis, possibly into Oklahoma as well. There certainly could be some tornadoes here, and I'm most concerned about northern Illinois at this point, but again, Indiana might get in on that. As we get into Wednesday afternoon, that threat shifts down into North Texas, anywhere from Texas to southeast Michigan, especially Indiana, Ohio, even western Kentucky are at risk for severe weather in the evening on Wednesday. That front's going to move through Thursday. There could be a little bit of rough weather across the mid-Atlantic and parts of the Northeast, but a better chance for severe weather over parts of North Texas. Same areas that got hit last week are going to be under the gun again later in the week this week. And we could see another active storm over the holiday weekend over the upper Midwest, as well as parts of Florida and Georgia. This is looking a lot like what it's looking like today by the time we get to this time next weekend. However, looks like a pretty good weekend across New England and the Northeast. High pressure just offshore, return flow should be heating up, should have some pretty good weather there. All right, folks, long video, but I appreciate y'all's time today. Thank you for watching. And as always, I ask you, if you did enjoy this video, I please or please consider subscribing. I appreciate if you can get this out to your friends as well. Anybody in the affected areas, anybody in the tropics, certainly needs to be on their toes for the weather that we're going to be dealing with here over the next few weeks. As always, I give all the glory to God. It's great being able to share my faith with everybody. I believe this is what I've been called to do as a Christian man. Everybody has a purpose on earth here. This is my purpose. It is to break down the science behind the weather, but to use my faith as well as a platform to just share the good news that the Lord is with us today and with us in all times. 2 Timothy 1:7, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Be not thou therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but be thou partaker of the afflictions of the gospel according to the power of God, who hath saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which has given us in Christ Jesus before the world began. I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with. As a scientist, I believe we're always trying to prove something, trying to prove the reasoning behind something. When you're a Christian, when you're a believer in God, you can't prove anything because you're going out on faith. God has given us this power. It's not supposed to be proven. It's supposed to be believed. And I think that's where I had struggled all of my life, was just believing that there was in fact a higher power. Just constantly being in fear of what might happen because of what I was studying, what I was learning, what was being theorized. But I will say this, once I realized that there was more than what I could even prove as a scientist, there was something higher out there, there was a reason behind everything, I just had to go out on faith and act in faith. Then I realized I should not be ashamed of that, because that is good news. That is the testimony of many men and women who have come before me, who have accepted Jesus as their Savior, because he rose from the dead so that we no longer had to carry those burdens. That's the reason I do what I do every day. It is going out in faith, not being fearful of what may happen, because fear is a down payment on something that may not ever happen. Faith is... The fear is false evidence appearing real. Faith is putting what you believe in action, going out there, using God as the power behind everything you do. Not just power, but love. Loving others the way that God has loved us. Going out with a sound mind and realizing that despite all the noise, all the bad things that happen out there, there's still a light that shines through that, and that is the light of Jesus Christ, our Savior. And I pray that you see that light. Even if you don't now, you may at some point in your life, but I pray it's sooner than later. If you are struggling in faith, I think a lot of us are at this point, that's perfectly fine. Everybody has struggled with their faith. All of Jesus's disciples struggled to believe what he was teaching them, and that's okay. But I do believe we need to continue to support each other and pray for each other. And if you have a prayer request, I'm going to go to the Lord in prayer later today and pray for you. Hope you all have a great weekend. I'll catch up with you soon next week. Take care.